Picture this. You're standing in the cobblestone streets of medieval London in 1305. At the centre of Smithfield, a massive crowd gathers around a wooden platform where a tall Scottish warrior stands with a noose around his neck. The executioner grins as he adjusts the rope, while English nobles watch from their raised seats, hungry for revenge. But this isn't a quick death. The crowd's excited whispers reveal something far more sinister. The executioner has measured the rope carefully, designed not to kill but to torture, because what they're about to do to William Wallace will take 3 agonizing hours to complete. This is one of the most brutal executions in human history. This is the story of a king's twisted need for revenge against a man who dared to fight for freedom. This is the story of a hero who refused to bow, even when facing the most horrific death imaginable. This is a tale that will haunt your dreams long after you hear it. To understand why this execution was so brutal, we need to go back 7 years, back to when William Wallace was just another Scottish nobleman living peacefully in the countryside. Scotland in 1298 was not a free country. King Edward I of England, called Longshanks because of his unusual height, had conquered Scotland. He stripped away Scottish laws, Scottish customs, and Scottish pride. Edward believed he owned Scotland the same way he owned his castle or his horse. The Scottish people were just property to him. William Wallace was different from other Scottish nobles. While many had bent the knee to Edward, Wallace refused. He was tall, strong, and had fire in his eyes that no amount of English pressure could put out. Wallace lived in a small town called Elderslie with his family. He watched English soldiers march through Scottish towns, taking food from Scottish children and gold from Scottish churches. He watched his countrymen bow their heads in shame. But Wallace also saw something the English missed. He saw anger building in Scottish hearts like steam in a kettle. He knew that one day that kettle would explode. In May 1297, English officials killed Wallace's father over a tax dispute. Some say they also murdered his wife, though history isn't certain about this detail. What we know for sure is that Wallace's world burned down in a single day. That night, Wallace gathered 30 men in a dark forest. By candlelight, he made them a promise. We will make the English pay for every drop of Scottish blood they've spilled. Within months, Wallace's 30 men became 300, then 3,000, then 30,000 Scottish warriors who followed him into battle, ready to die for freedom. September 11, 1297, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace faced an English army twice the size of his own. The English commander, John de Warenne, was so confident he didn't even bother putting on his armour that morning. Wallace waited. He watched thousands of English soldiers cross a narrow bridge over the River Forth. The bridge could only fit 2 horses side by side. When exactly half the English army had crossed, Wallace raised his sword and screamed one word: "Now!" Scottish warriors poured down from the hills like an avalanche. They cut the English army in half. Those trapped on the bridge couldn't retreat. Those still crossing couldn't advance. In 4 hours, Wallace's farmers and blacksmiths destroyed England's finest knights. John de Warenne escaped with his life, but his pride was shattered. Of the 15,000 English soldiers who woke up that morning, only 3,000 saw sunset. Wallace had done the impossible. He had beaten the unbeatable English war machine. After Stirling Bridge, William Wallace became Guardian of Scotland. For 1 shining year, Scotland was free. But Wallace faced a terrible choice. He could make peace with Edward, accept English rule, and live comfortably as a puppet ruler. Many Scottish nobles begged him to take this deal. Or he could continue fighting, knowing that Edward would eventually return with a bigger army and probably crush Scotland forever. Wallace walked alone in the Scottish Highlands, wrestling with this decision. The wind whispered through the heather, and Wallace felt the weight of his entire nation on his shoulders. He thought about his father's death, his people's suffering, the children who went to bed hungry because English tax collectors took their food. Then he thought about Edward's offer of peace. Peace without freedom. Peace as slaves. Wallace made his choice. He would rather die fighting than live kneeling. He had no idea that King Edward was already planning something far worse than death. When news of Stirling Bridge reached King Edward, he flew into a rage that terrified his own advisers. He threw his crown across the room and screamed until his voice was raw. This wasn't just about Scotland anymore. This was personal. Edward had spent his entire life building the image of the perfect, unbeatable English king. Wallace had shattered that image in front of the entire world. Edward called his advisors to a secret meeting. Killing Wallace quickly would make him a martyr, he said, his eyes cold as winter. I want him to suffer. I want his death to be so horrible that no one will ever dare rebel against England again. The advisors exchanged nervous glances. They had seen Edward's cruelty before, but this was different. This was hatred so pure it had turned into madness. Edward spent months designing Wallace's execution. He studied ancient Roman punishment methods. He consulted with professional torturers. He wanted to create a death so terrible that people would whisper about it for 1,000 years. He succeeded. By 1304, Wallace was a hunted man. Edward had placed a bounty on his head so large that it could buy a castle. Wallace hid in caves and abandoned farmhouses. He ate raw fish and drank from muddy streams. His once mighty army had scattered like leaves in a storm. But Wallace still had friends, or so he thought. John de Menteith was a Scottish knight who had sworn loyalty to Wallace. For months, Menteith sheltered Wallace in his castle, providing food and protection. What Wallace didn't know was that Menteith had already sold his soul to King Edward. On August 5, 1305, Menteith invited Wallace to dinner. They shared bread and wine like old friends. They laughed about battles they had fought together. When Wallace fell asleep that night, he felt safe for the first time in years. He woke up in chains. Menteith had drugged his wine. English soldiers surrounded his bed. Wallace's 7-year fight for freedom was over. As they dragged him away, Menteith couldn't look Wallace in the eye. The 30 pieces of silver in his pocket felt heavier than lead. 3 weeks later, Wallace stood in Westminster Hall before England's highest court. But this wasn't really a trial, it was theatre. The judges had already decided Wallace's fate before he entered the room. Edward wanted the world to see English justice in action. The prosecutor read the charges. William Wallace, you are accused of treason against His Majesty King Edward, murder of English soldiers, and rebellion against lawful authority. Wallace listened in silence. When asked how he pleaded, he gave an answer that shocked everyone in the room. I cannot be guilty of treason against a king who was never my king. I cannot be guilty of murder when defending my homeland. I cannot be guilty of rebellion when fighting for freedom. The prosecutor's face turned red. You admit your crimes. Wallace smiled. I admit I fought for Scotland. I admit I killed English invaders. I admit I would do it all again. The judge banged his gavel. William Wallace, you are sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. May God have mercy on your soul. Wallace's response sent chills through the courtroom. God doesn't need to have mercy on my soul, but he should have mercy on yours. August 23, 1305. Dawn breaks over London like a wound in the sky. Wallace wakes in the Tower of London to the sound of hammers. Outside his window, carpenters are building his execution platform. English soldiers drag him from his cell. They tie his hands behind his back and force him onto a horse. A rope around his waist connects him to the horse's saddle. The horse moves slowly through London's narrow streets. Behind Wallace marches a parade of English nobles, soldiers, and citizens. Some throw rotten vegetables, others spit. Children point and laugh, not understanding what they're watching. But Wallace notices something the English miss. In the crowd are faces that don't belong, Scottish merchants who have travelled hundreds of miles, Irish fishermen who should be working their boats, Welsh miners covered in coal dust. Word has spread throughout the Celtic lands. They came to witness something they never thought they'd see, one of their own refusing to break. Wallace sits straight on his horse, his head held high. Every step brings him closer to agony, but he will not give King Edward the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. The horse stops. They have reached Smithfield. The executioner at Smithfield is a professional. His name is lost to history, but his methods are unforgettable. He has performed dozens of executions, but never one ordered to last this long. King Edward's instructions were specific. Wallace must suffer maximum pain while staying alive as long as possible. First comes the hanging. But this isn't the quick neck snap of later centuries. The executioner places the noose around Wallace's throat and slowly raises him just high enough that his toes barely touch the platform. Wallace can breathe, but barely. The rope burns his neck, his vision blurs, his lungs fight for every breath. The crowd cheers as Wallace's face turns purple. Some nobles lean forward in their seats, not wanting to miss a second of the show. After exactly 20 minutes, timed by an hourglass, the executioner lowers Wallace back to the platform. Wallace gasps for air like a drowning man. But the executioner isn't finished. He produces a long, curved knife. "Time for the drawing," he announces to the crowd. Wallace knows what comes next. Every Scottish child had heard whispered stories of English executions. Drawing means they will cut open his belly while he's still alive and pull out his organs piece by piece. The executioner's blade catches the morning sunlight as he approaches. The executioner places his knife against Wallace's stomach. The crowd holds its breath. But then something unexpected happens. The executioner hesitates. He looks into Wallace's eyes and sees something that makes his hand shake. No fear, no pleading, just acceptance. Wallace speaks quietly so only the executioner can hear. "Do what you must, but know that Scotland will remember this day." The executioner's job requires him to cut carefully, to make the torture last, but Wallace's calm voice has shaken him. The blade goes in. Wallace's scream echoes across Smithfield like the cry of a wounded eagle. Blood pours onto the wooden platform. The smell of iron fills the air. English nobles cheer, but some Scottish faces in the crowd begin to weep. The executioner reaches inside Wallace's body and pulls out his stomach. Wallace is still conscious, still breathing, still refusing to beg. "Ask for the king's mercy," the executioner shouts. "End this now." Wallace's voice is weak but clear. "I need no man's mercy." The executioner moves to the final stage, quartering. 4 horses wait at the corners of the platform. Ropes connect them to Wallace's arms and legs. This is the moment King Edward has been waiting for, the moment when Wallace's unbreakable spirit finally breaks. A messenger rides up to the platform, carrying Edward's final offer. "His Majesty grants you one last chance. Bow to England, renounce your rebellion, and your death will be quick." The crowd falls silent. Even the horses seem to sense the importance of this moment. Wallace lifts his head. Blood runs down his chin, but his eyes are still fierce. "Tell your king," Wallace's voice carries across the silent market square, "tell him that Scotland's freedom is worth more than one man's life." The messenger's face goes pale. He had expected Wallace to break. Everyone had expected him to break. Instead, Wallace had just delivered his own death sentence. The executioner raises his hand, the horse drivers grip their reins. King Edward himself appears on a balcony overlooking Smithfield. He had come to personally witness Wallace's surrender. Instead, he watches his greatest enemy choose death over submission. Edward's face twists with rage and something else, something that looks almost like respect. The horses begin to pull, slowly at first, then faster. Wallace's body stretches like a bowstring. The crowd winces, but Wallace doesn't scream. Instead, he does something that no one expects. He smiles. Not a grin of madness or pain, but a peaceful smile of a man who knows he has already won. The horses pull harder. Wallace's body can't take much more, but in his final moments, something magical happens. Wallace's voice rises one last time, somehow carrying over the noise of the crowd and the creaking of ropes. "Scotland will be free." These words hit the crowd like lightning. Scottish faces in the audience begin to weep openly. Even some English citizens look uncomfortable. The horses give one final pull. William Wallace dies, but his legend is just beginning. King Edward had planned this execution to terrify people into submission. Instead, he created the most powerful symbol of resistance in Scottish history. Within hours, riders are galloping north to Scotland with news of Wallace's death. Within days, his final words spread to every village and farm. Within years, a new Scottish hero named Robert the Bruce leads another rebellion, and this time, inspired by Wallace's sacrifice, the Scots win their freedom forever. Edward's plan had backfired completely. In trying to destroy Wallace, he had made him immortal. 700 years later, people still remember William Wallace's name. They remember his courage, his refusal to surrender, his willingness to suffer unimaginable pain rather than betray his beliefs. King Edward I died 2 years later, bitter and defeated, knowing he had failed to break the Scottish spirit. Today, a statue of William Wallace stands near the spot where he died. Tourists from around the world come to Smithfield to honour a man who chose freedom over life. The executioner's platform is long gone. The cheering crowd has turned to dust. King Edward's empire has crumbled. But Wallace's words still echo through history. Scotland will be free. And Scotland is free, because sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning the battle, but from refusing to lose your soul.